Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I really think that one of the important movements forward we've made in this whole area now is for women to be able to participate in sports and not just be spectators.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Ernie Sibley, who is a local businessman and teacher. Father Bacik and Mr. Sibley will discuss sports and sexism. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Ernie, you know, you and I talk easily together. I've enjoyed our conversations over the years, and it strikes me that one of the common bonds is sports, because you and I, simply can pick a particular player out of the air and begin to discuss him. We have this long-standing traditional interest in sports, and there's sort of an original bonding around that. And if we don't have anything else to talk about, we talk easily about that. And so I thought maybe we could pursue that a little bit and talk about sports and the fascination of sports. I'm especially interested in it from the spectator viewpoint and what that all means to us. And I want to even close the topic maybe a little bit more and talk about sports and sexism. Now, maybe we are ruled out of that conversation being both males here, but at least we can talk about it from our perspective.
Yes, Jim, I'm aware that sports tends to be rather a male shorthand, particularly males of your generation and mine, where if we have nothing else to talk about, or even if we do, we slide easily into the topic of sports and find a great deal of common ground, even though, you're a priest and I'm a businessman. But that seems to furnish a shorthand for some sort of bonding, and we share the esoterica of, particular obscure players for particular teams, and we know how to do that based on 50 years of life experience. And I have to wonder, I'm aware nowadays when I'm with groups, mixed groups, it's still a male phenomenon predominantly, and males can come together on that topic easily, no matter what their backgrounds. Females are usually shut out.
I was thinking that how we do that, I think we sort of feel our way with that when in an all-male group, the conversation, well, the game's coming up, who you're rooting for, or a comment on recently, did you see the game on television, sort of thing. And then you sort of get a reading of the other person. You begin to find out
who sits up in their chair and
right.
perks up. And then you hitchhike in each other in sort of a symmetrical escalation where everybody's participating. I've never been in a group where I wasn't knowledgeable on the topic. I should think it'd be really tough on a male not to know anything about sports.
I was thinking that same thing, and that was my sense of feeling my way with it. If I'm just a one-to-one conversation or in a group, you might throw that out, and the guy says, oh, I didn't know the Celtics won last week or something. Well, you begin to know that
the Cleveland Celtics.
Yeah, right.
And you get the idea that your language and theirs are, sort of ships passing by in the night.
There's always those telltale signs of things. It's like the saying that they saw the night game recently at Wrigley Field in Chicago. Now, that's going to change, of course. But in years past, did you see the 1956 night game at Wrigley Field?
Yes.
Well, and the guy, the guy is not into sports at this point.
And at that point, there's always a matter of stillness and quietness while I try to shift gears, also processing at the same time how I feel about a guy that doesn't know anything about sports. And, knowing something about sports, and most of the people, males I know, that do, the relationship is immediately diminished, and he has to build up credibility. He can be a superb theologian, but somehow he needs to reestablish himself for me, which is sad, if he doesn't know anything about sports.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting the way we do deal with people that way. I think that a lot of that has to do with our background and growing up, doesn't it? I think in my own family, sports were so important, and some of my strongest memories are my father taking me to games and playing catch with me in the yard and encouraging me in sports and teaching me about it and so on. And it became the language that we shared. At any point, we could recall World Series games or even going to sandlot ball games together, or his career as a ball player was always fascinating to me, and he always came to watch me play and so on, hardly ever missed a game. And all of that, really was important, and it became the common bonding. And of course, it always said more than that, but on the surface at least, that was what one could talk about. I mean, I can still remember phrases that my father used when I was little. I remember we went to a game, and it was a high school game, and my father used the phrase, he was watching the catcher, and he says, he was big and strong, but he was not polished. And I still remember that phrase, and my dad, and I must have been talking to him coming home in the car, and my dad not wanting me to seem, too precocious or something. He says, well, that isn't the kind of thing you say to somebody else, that this catcher was not polished. He chided me before, he was telling me about a way that you deal with this male world that you're talking about. A 7-year-old doesn't walk in and say such and such a catcher was not polished. At least my father didn't think I should do that. That was something that in adult conversation wasn't right for the 7-year-old to be saying. So, in other words, what I was getting from my father, I suppose, were signals not only about the sport, but about how one responds to it and how one talks about it. There was an acceptable language in his mind and a language that's not acceptable.
I agree. I think probably you and I learned a whole language related to sports. It was probably our first exposure to rules, clear-cut rules of right and wrong. Parents usually are rather fuzzy on the middle range rights and wrongs. Sometimes you should be in bed by 8:30, at other times it's okay to stay up till 9:30. But in sports, from our earliest years, we had very clear-cut rules, and what was right and acceptable, and what was wrong and unacceptable. And there weren't really any shades of gray. It was a very clear world, and also the language was very clear. Once again, Wrigley Field in a night game, that was purely and simply not acceptable. You knew that didn't happen, or the Cleveland Celtics or whatever.
I remember a clear experience when I was teaching in high school, and I used to, it was one of my ways of relating to the guys in the school was through sports, and to go to the gym and play with them and so on. And at one time the sophomore girls said, well, why don't you do that with us? How come, we're excluded from this? And I remember setting up a time and going there, and I sort of saw my role as sort of observer at this point, and so that they were to start the game, in 4-on-4 or whatever it was, a basketball game, and they were really unable to play the game because there was so much argument and reinterpretation of the rules and so on. And that plays into this thing we're talking about, sports and sexism, I believe, that I saw, that shocked me at the time. That was back in the 60s, early 60s, I guess. And what became clear to me is that the young women in this case simply didn't have experience in doing that. I mean, the guys, if they went and played, they might argue, but there was sort of clear cut. When you got me, you take it out, and it works. It works because there's all kind of experience of how you have a game without referees and call the fouls and adjudicate all the claims and so on. But the young women didn't have that kind of experience, and thus really were not able to play the game without referees or without my jumping in and saying, no, she fouled you, you take it out.
And trying to explain the whole rationale for that.
I really think that one of the important movements forward we've made in this whole area now is for women to be able to participate in sports and not just be spectators. To take us back to that interplay of being spectator and the sexism thing, so that the thing that high school girls had in their mind was to be cheerleaders for the boys' games. So it became all oriented on their activities, and the young women in this case were reduced to being spectators or being the cheerleaders. And I just feel that we're in such a healthier space these days when women are able to, there's more opportunities for women to play sports in the schools at the collegiate level. I mean, boy, isn't it marvelous that women's collegiate basketball, for example. I mean, they are getting so good, and they're enjoyable to watch, and they're getting publicity on national television, and the games are being shown, and that has to be showing to young women that, well, we could do this, and it's a worthwhile thing to participate in.
I think one of the things probably you and I learned from playing sports as a youngster is a sense of justice in terms of what is fair and what is unfair, being brought up through that tradition of you play by the rules or you're not being fair or just. With that sense of justice, it only appears correct to me that nowadays women have an equal opportunity to play sports as men have an equal opportunity not to play sports or not to be a professional jock watcher, so to speak, in terms of having to know everything about the Cleveland Browns. I'm aware that there's, once again, the quiet when I talk to a guy and he doesn't know anything about the Browns, but I recognize it's my problem, not his problem, and that not every male has to know about sports. And also, from a sense of justice point of view, that women have equal opportunity to play sports and have some of these same energies and learnings available that we had available for us.
That's interesting, Ernie, the kind of distortions that creep into this, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. In other words, you and I think of sports positively, at least in large measure, although I notice my own sense of when I'm depressed, I'm very likely to think of baseball and my own failed career, that way, my inabilities. That goes together for me. It's quite remarkable. If I'm depressed, I will surely have some sort of memory of failures on the baseball diamond that go with that. But that's a little parenthetical statement from what I want to get at, the distortions that occur. Fundamentally, we have positive experiences, but I think we have to remember where others have been hurt by sports. And you've brought it up from two sides. I think we should explore it. One is men who have not been good at sports and haven't liked sports and are and have to deal with that kind of culture in which that's sort of expected. So you put it in terms of when you met somebody, a guy who wasn't interested in sports, they sort of had to reestablish their credibility with you. Now, that really is a distortion in your thinking.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that's not a fair outlook, and it's not a way to judge somebody. But you've spoken honestly, and you've spoken for many other males who end up feeling that same way, I think. And therefore, we have to uncover that distortion. That would be a reverse part of this sexism problem we're talking about. It gets back to the idea of allowing people to be who they are. I mean, some people like ballet and others don't. Some people like football and others don't. I mean, that's the human prerogative. It's a human fact, and we have to be careful not to stereotype people that way. So let's stay with the men thing, because that is a problem. I think, although I know some males who don't like sports and who are very at ease with it. In other words, they've come to terms with that. It's not a big thing. It's like somebody else not liking some other activity, and that they don't play the piano, but they don't have an inferiority complex over it. Hey. And I know males like that, it seems to me, who have risen above the cultural expectations. I give them a lot of credit and a lot of respect for being able to, I'm not into sports. I'm not interested in them. I don't like them, and that's fine. And that's what I think we need to get, so that anybody who's not into sports doesn't feel put down because they're not.
Oh, I agree. Now, anybody who played sports or experienced sports was familiar with the phenomenon of inclusion and exclusion. And you and I learned to cope very quickly at a very young age with the phenomenon of being the last one chosen, if we were chosen at all. I suspect people who didn't experience sports have had learned to cope with that somewhat later, the phenomenon of exclusion, which is a perfectly natural human phenomenon that we all run into in many settings. Once again, you and I were blessed, or cursed sometimes in retrospect, with getting accustomed to being excluded. There were kids bigger, faster, better hitters, better pitchers, better eyesight than we were. There weren't many naturals at my time. There was always one natural around in each sport that I could sort of hold myself up to and realize how short I fell. But once again, we had the experience of exclusion early, and a lot of people haven't had that and haven't learned, had
or
the chance
they
to
meet
cope.
the problem only later in life
Exactly.
with a much more serious sort of consequences for it. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, being cut from a team is, was traumatic in those days, and I can think of clear examples of that, and the utter futility of it all at that point. So that is something that one seems to learn, and it was, again, since young girls didn't have that experience, it's part of, they've had to learn that coping skill, I'm sure, in other ways that maybe we don't understand or know
Right.
about. But they were deprived of the opportunity of learning it in that fashion, and that was always so painful. And I think back to Fran Tarkington talking one time after they lost the Super Bowl game, and an uncharacteristic comment, something like, "Well, it really is just a game; it's a sport," and that note of realism to come from someone who had competed with such great passion. And so, I mean, I thought that was a great remark and a great
I did
reminder.
too, but I was startled by it because for me often, particularly when I was growing up, it was much more than a game. It was life and living life at its fullest and fantasizing myself in Dodger Stadium, last at the ninth, bases loaded, 3-2, etc. So just a game, yes, but when you talk about realism and objectivity, at my age, I have to be very depressed to look back at my failures. I find I have heightened my successes. And anybody who knew me at that age would be startled by how heroic I was in retrospect, 40 and 50 years later, because I certainly wasn't heroic at the time. Now, how many people have had the experience of being a hero even for a microsecond? Andy Warhol says everybody's famous for 15 minutes. Well, I suspect you were famous when you got a game-winning hit, or I was famous when I was a winning pitcher. Brief, but gee, it was neat. What a great experience.
Yeah, and again, that becomes part of that common bonding that you were talking about. Both the successes and the failures then become something that one talks about and becomes part of the folklore. And so, I can remember my father talking about, games where he went 0 for 5 and after striking out 3 times, finally hit a bloody one back to the pitcher, as he said, and that became, part of what one shared also. It was a way of talking about one's limitations. I suppose it was often set in sort of a macho world. I mean, as we say, again, from the sexism side, that males have not had the opportunity to express weaknesses or failures,
Right.
or to be able to cry in public, etc. And maybe we use sports in some ways to identify with the losing side. Maybe we do that as spectators yet. And maybe there's a way in which we could talk about the fact, well, golfers do with this with I can't putt. I mean, nobody usually steps up and says, I can't hit 5 irons, but it's acceptable to say I can't putt. I don't know why, but that's okay, and you don't somehow lose your masculinity because you can't putt. However, if you say I choked on the 5 iron that I needed on number 18 to reach the green, this is not really acceptable kind of male talk.
No, choking was one of the worst things we ever considered,
Right.
and we all experienced it, but I never named it except in the privacy of my own room later on.
Right, and it was the worst thing that you could say to somebody else, and even that sign became, the choking sign became, a terrible thing to do to somebody else. But maybe, again, from the male side, we used at least some of the failures in sports as a way of talking about limitations. It was all right to say I couldn't hit the curveball, that's why I never really made it as a ball player. You hear guys say that. From the other side of the thing, to turn to the women's side and the sexism problem with sports, again, it would seem as though we have moved forward so much with women being able to play and having those opportunities and more money available for them and so on, for them to have that kind of experience. Not that it's the only way to learn to deal with failure or success. And I think non-sports people really resent that kind of talk, and I think properly
Right.
so. It's like saying if you don't like classical music, well, then you can't really be a full human being, or you don't know any music at all. So I think we have to be careful of that. And yet, I do think that there is something new here afoot, and that women are learning this. You want to comment on that? Because I had another direction to go in yet, too.
Yes, just briefly. The phenomenon of coaches and mentors, I think little boys, young boys were experienced at identifying good coaches and mentors and using them and trying to find role models and mentors. And I suspect they carry that into older ages in the business setting or a university setting, where they find people who can mentor them effectively. And I suspect many women or males who weren't able to participate in sports learned with more difficulty how to do that later on, where it was something of a natural. You had your dad, you had some good coaches periodically, older people, wiser people who guided you and helped you learn.
Yeah, that's very true, I think, yeah. And I suppose if we pursued that at some length, that would take us in another direction, but I think it does filter into the topic, as you're saying, a certain deprivation along that line with many women in our culture. I was thinking about the way conversation works these days. I remember being in a conversation about baseball, and there was probably 4 guys and 1 woman present, and I remember myself directing almost all my comments to them, and after the conversation, feeling sort of bad that I hadn't included the woman. And I was in the setting again, and with some of the same participants, the same woman for sure, and I remember trying consciously to include her. And as a matter of fact, she knew quite a bit about sports, and I was able to contribute to the conversation. But it had to be on my part sort of a conscious effort. And I think that needs to be part of this cultural shift that we're having. It's like women getting into the all-male clubs.
Absolutely.
That's the image that comes to me. I mean, these all-male clubs where we not only talk business, but we talk sports, and therefore women get excluded from the real decision-making. So guys go out and play golf, and maybe it's over a beer in the 19th hole that the business deal is made, and women get excluded from all of that.
I was reading in the paper yesterday where Sandra Day O'Connor, the Supreme Court Justice, is an avid golfer, and she's prohibited by accident of her gender from playing Burning Tree Golf Club in Bethesda outside of Washington. And that's a fascinating phenomenon. How can one conceivably exclude somebody like Sandra Day O'Connor?
There is so much stereotyping that goes with this. I was out on the golf course recently, and there was a twosome there, and I was with a twosome, and the starter said there was a woman that was going to play, and that she was, it wasn't clear whether she was going to play which twosome, and the twosome ahead of us, really didn't want her to play with them, and oh no, why us, and so on. Well, she came out, and it turns out that the one person in the twosome ahead of us was very gentlemanly at that point, and went up and asked her to join them, even though his previous comments were very sexist oriented. But he came to the fore at that point, and brought the woman on board, and so we were standing there watching, of course, and the woman turned out to be quite a fine player, and probably was going to beat both of the guys there, and it was, in the interplay ahead of time, there was some talk of that, she might really be good or something like that, but she was very self-assured and moved right into the setting and handled it beautifully, and the guy did rise to the occasion and act, in his behavior at least, was open and gentlemanly. But that byplay that went on ahead of time indicates the stereotyping and that is involved in sexism. I mean, that's what sexism is, of course.
Absolutely. And of course, our side of it is that somehow we are supposed to be more powerful, more competent, just by accident of our gender. We are supposed to know how to do these things. So it's just as, I don't want to say just as confining, but it's confining to you and I in terms of, since we're male, we're supposed to have this particular expertise.
Would it bother you to play golf with a woman who beat you?
Oh, I won a Scotch twosome tournament in the state of Connecticut once with the state amateur champion, Gracie Lenzik. And she outdrove me by 40 yards when I was playing very well and was just a superb golfer. So it was never an issue. Most of the ladies I played with at that time were excellent golfers.
And there's sort of an expectation set up, wasn't it? I mean, if you play with Nancy Lopez, I mean, you're
I
not
was
going to play.
To lose, exactly.
Yeah, you know that ahead of time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was okay, and I was comfortable with that. Skill was the bottom denominator. It's just I had not much experience in many sports of women with a comparable skill level.
Let me tell you what a coach of a women's basketball team told me, that one of the differences he found is that the women were not as interested in watching basketball on television as his male players were, collegiate level. And he was just, this was just an observation on his part, that they weren't as interested as watching. He said, well, if it got down to the finals of the women's tournament, they probably would watch, but they wouldn't be glued to the set like his male players would be at almost any level. You know, if there's a good college game on or a good pro game on, they're in there watching it. And he found this difference. I have no idea what to make of that, but it is interesting.
That's interesting to me. For me, it was always logical if I were a participant, I would also be a spectator, and there was the same sort of compulsion to spectate that there was to participate. And that's why, at my age where there aren't many sports I still play, I find they don't invite me to play on the teams anymore. I'm sure I would be the star of the team if they still invited me, but for whatever reason they don't invite me. But I'm sure if I played, I would be superb. Once again, back to the exclusion phenomenon.
Got to be brief, Ernie. Few seconds. I think we got to wind up.
Okay.
I can't let you go off on that. So we've been talking about sports and sexism, really, and trying to see how really there's problems for males who have not competed that much and aren't interested, and we can't let them feel left out. In the same token, women, we've made progress, women coming into the field of sports, and I think that will enable all of us to relate in a better way.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Ernie Sibley, who is a local businessman and teacher. The topic of this week's Reflections was sports and sexism. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.